Whenever I encounter this text, I think of Alice Farnham. Alice was a member of my church in Cleveland, and she was famous for two things. She was the daughter of the architect of Archwood's beautiful colonial-style sanctuary, where she sat under the high barrel-vaulted ceiling every Sunday by the tall, plain windows that filled the room with light. But more importantly, she was important for bringing her homemade potato chips to every potluck. Now, Alice was barely 100 pounds, short and slender, and had been severely bent over for most of her life. Her 80-year-old body was so rigid that if you hugged her too hard, you were afraid of breaking her. And she had to lean backward in order to look you in the face. Now, to make her famous potato chips, she rode the bus to buy potatoes at the West Side Market, which is a 100-year-old open-air market crowded with people bumping into each other while they move among dozens of fruit and vegetable stands. Alice wasn't very strong, so she couldn't carry a lot. She'd buy maybe 6 or 7 small potatoes, ride the bus back home a few miles, walk several blocks to her house, walk back to the bus, ride it again to the market, and slowly repeat it all day long. And then she used her gnarled hands to cut thin slices and put them in boiling oil. I can't even imagine how much effort it took, but she didn't do it for admiration or attention. It was a very laborious labor of love like few others would do. And in return, she was loved and appreciated. Well, the bent-over woman at the synagogue that day wasn't looking for attention either. She was among the faithful people who went to synagogue every Sabbath. I doubt very many people ever noticed her in the crowd. She hadn't gone there that day in order to seek healing. But for some reason, in the crowd, Jesus saw her. And that's all it says. Jesus saw her. He called her over, placed his hands on her, and said, "Woman, you are set free." She stood up straight and began praising God. Now, stories about healing in the Bible are complicated because, among other things, they often involve the tension of why her and not someone else. For example, Alice, why not her? I mean, how many times in 80 years of faithful every Sunday church attendance had Alice heard the story of the bent-over woman and wondered what that would be like? What would it be like to look someone straight in the eye, or to drive, swim, to have no more back and neck pain? I mean, we celebrate healing stories as wonderful acts of God, even as we are confounded by the difficult questions of why God doesn't act like that for everyone. But healing is not the end of this story. For the first time in 18 years, the woman could stand up straight, maybe even raise her hands above her head in praise. But this miraculous act drew condemnation from the synagogue leader, who spoke to the crowd, not directly to Jesus, about how he broke the rules about Sabbath. Now, following faithful observance of Sabbath meant there were 39 different kinds of labor one should not do. Anything done to save a life was permitted, but rabbinic authorities were divided on whether non-life-threatening conditions were permitted, such as the condition of the bent-over woman or the man with the withered hand Jesus had also healed on the Sabbath earlier in Luke, which drew condemnation as well. And why these prohibitions? Because of the fourth of the 10 Commandments. In Exodus 20, it says, "Remember the Sabbath day and treat it holy. 6 days you may work and do all your tasks, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. Do not do any work on it, not you, your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, your animals, or the immigrant who is living among you. Because the Lord made the heavens and earth, the sea, and everything that is in them in 6 days, but rested on the seventh day." This is why the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Once a week, rest is a sacred duty, more important than even work. Think how radical that is. Rest is a holy activity, a gift directly from God. And it's not about rules. It's about love for us. But did you know there are 2 lists of 10 commandments? There is the more familiar one in Exodus, tied to the creation story that focuses on the 7th day because God rested. But there's also a list of 10 commandments in the book of Deuteronomy. Now, they're the same commandments, but they have a different focus. And in Deuteronomy, it's not about honoring the 7th day of creation, but rather keep the Sabbath. You shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, but the Lord your God brought you out of there with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. That's why the Lord your God commands you to keep the Sabbath day. Sabbath is tied to freedom from bondage. So when Jesus responded to the synagogue leader about the Sabbath, Jesus was talking about the 4th commandment of the 10 in Deuteronomy, because he described his actions as liberation. He said, "You are set free." He released her from bondage. So by healing on the Sabbath, Jesus wasn't disregarding the importance of the law. He wasn't criticizing the observance of Sabbath, but that their interpretation was too limited. Jesus demonstrated that Sabbath is to commemorate the freedom of slaves, and therefore freeing this woman from her bondage is completely in line with the intention of the Sabbath commandment. So yes, rest is a holy activity, a sacred duty, but it's more. It is liberation from that which keeps you in bondage all week. Who holds you back during the week? What holds you down during the week? Take a day off from that every week. And if only for a day, we are released from stress with the practice of gratitude in worship. If only for a day, we are free from domination by people who control our lives by remembering we are children of the Most High God who desires our freedom. Oh, what more could we ask than that? So while all this action between Jesus and the synagogue leader is going on, the woman's off to the side, still in wonderment about how she can move her neck. Has the sky always been that blue? She had always heard birds flying, but now she could watch them without moving her whole body. And she could take a full breath, a full deep breath again for the first time in nearly 2 decades. You have to wonder, what happened to her 18 years ago? Did she have an accident? Was it some kind of illness? Jesus said she was set free from her sickness, but that can mean a lot of things. Eugene Peterson described her as, quote, twisted and bent over with arthritis. But the original text speaks of her being afflicted by a spirit. Doesn't mean a demonic spirit. Think, what kind of spirit? And you think, well, maybe a spirit of grief. You know, a spirit of grief over the loss of someone she could not bear losing 18 years ago. Someone like a child. Or perhaps a spirit of rage, a spirit of anger at something that was done to her she cannot let go of. Or a spirit of guilt over something she had done to someone else. Or maybe it was a spirit of worthlessness. You know, a spirit of insignificance after being condemned by harsh words or physical abuse. Feeling as though you have no value can bend you over physically, perpetually looking down not only on the ground but upon yourself. There are many spirits that can weigh us down. But from whatever it was that, whatever spirit had held her back from flourishing, Jesus saw her. He spoke to her and set her free. But if only it had been the next day, right? Jesus healed her on the wrong day. The religious authority asked, "What's your hurry? Why couldn't she wait? She's been bent over for 18 years. Do it tomorrow when it's legal." How many people who seek their liberation have been told to wait or do it a different way? Has anyone ever asked you, "What's your hurry?" A man in Texas wrote a letter to Dr. King that read, "All Christians know that the colored people will receive equal rights eventually. But is it possible that you are in too great of a religious hurry?" But Dr. King noted that wait often means never. On April 3rd of 1963, a series of actions began in Birmingham, Alabama to bring national attention to efforts to desegregate public facilities. Lunch counter sit-ins, sit-ins at the library, kneel-ins at churches, marches on City Hall and county courthouses, and a boycott of downtown merchants. After every other legal avenue and attempt at moral persuasion had failed, all that was left was direct action. 8 clergymen responded by issuing an appeal for law and order and common sense, published in the local paper, which read in part, "We recognize the natural impatience of people who feel their hopes are slow in being realized. But demonstrations to realize those hopes are unwise and untimely." On April 10th, the city obtained a state court injunction against the protests, and 2 days later, on Good Friday, Dr. King was arrested for violating that injunction and placed in solitary confinement for 10 days. From the Birmingham jail, he asked those 8 clergymen why they deplored the demonstrations more than the conditions that made them necessary. Just like the synagogue leader. If only he had expressed as much concern for the woman as he did for the rule. Actually, however, he simply didn't understand that it's not a commandment to keep someone down with burdens, but a commandment to help us stand up with freedom. That's what Jesus demonstrated. But the leader didn't understand, and instead he criticized Jesus. And by the logic of the synagogue leader, there had been 5,634 previously acceptable days to heal the woman, and one more can't hurt. And we might tend to agree. I mean, that seems reasonable. Why can't Jesus wait one more day? But if Jesus couldn't wait, why would we? You know, what's the rush with affordable housing? We have rules to follow. But why are the needs and fears of property owners of more value than the unhoused? Or teachers and firefighters and students graduating from college who can't afford to live here? What's the rush with the asylum seekers? I mean, why can't they wait? What's the rush with addressing climate change? As the temperatures rise to unbearable levels, as the seas rise to drown island villages, as forests burn and choke the air, what's the rush? I mean, what's wrong with one more day? Decades of one more day have shown us. So even as the Reverend Dr. William Barber asked these same questions, he can sympathize with the bent-over woman. He has the form of arthritis known as ankylosing spondylitis that leads to the fusion of the spine. It tries to close your chest cavity over time, and some days his eyes turn red and he loses his vision. Inflammation in his neck, spine, and hips causes immense pain throughout his body. And to watch him move is to grimace in sympathy. And yet he's everywhere all the time, relying on his old beat-up cane. He's the closest thing we have to a modern-day Dr. King. He's a preacher, a prophet, and a prolific organizer. He started the Moral Monday movement in North Carolina in 2013, and this past June organized the Poor People's Campaign in Washington, D.C. Holding up his cane, he says, "This has marched in marches. It's been in the jailhouse, the White House, and Senate confirmation hearings." And despite his body's crushing pain, for the rest of his life, he's committed to continue the cause of low-wage people. Black, brown, white, housing and immigration reform, Christian nationalism, and LGBTQ rights. And he always talks about healthcare access, grateful for his, and insists the United States needs a heart transplant. How does he keep going? He said, if the pain says I can't, even then I'm going to find a way to do something to be with those in this country who every day have inflicted upon them the restrictions of a democracy that's full of the arthritis of inequality. How can he do it? He said, I was taught in my faith tradition that you don't live life and rust out. You wear out. You fight on. You live by faith and not by sight. You take the life you're handed and make a difference with the life you have. What does it say that Jesus didn't delay? It says that the time for freedom for the oppressed is not tomorrow. The only day for liberation is today. No more excuses. Alice Farnham, William Barber, and the woman bent over for 18 years didn't wait for better days. So whether we feel limited by pain in our body, or a spirit of fear, or a spirit of guilt, or a spirit that says we lack worth, what are you waiting for? There is so much you can do. Why wait to act even one more day? Amen.